to the world. Subscribe now to the Hot 97 YouTube channel. It's Ebro in the Morning with Laura Stiles and Rosenberg.
It's Ebro in the Morning. Laura Stiles is out being moms. She'll be back soon. We got the bro Rosenberg, and our guy from Brooklyn, Hakeem Jeffries, is back on the program. They call you the number 5 House Democrat. What does that mean, Hakeem?
Well, good morning, Ebro. Great to be with you. Peter, great to be with you. Great to be back on the show.
Thank you, brother.
In terms of the leadership within the House, you've got the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. She's got the number 1 position in terms of leadership hierarchy. We have the Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer. He's at number 2. The Majority Whip, Jim Clyburn, the great Jim Clyburn from South Carolina. He's number 3. Then you have the Assistant Speaker, Catherine Clark from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She's at the number 4 position. She was just elected. And then I have the honor of serving as the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, which puts me at the number 5 position in terms of House leadership. And so when you hear folks making that reference, that is what they are referring to.
So the reason I wanted to have you on today is because as we enter this next political cycle or phase, right, we have right now the Senate seat races in Georgia. We have the President-elect Biden and the Vice President ready to go on January 20th. And then after that, it seems like obviously there'll be a bunch of, passing of bills and stimulus and reviving the economy. And, there'll be all of that stuff going on. And then we'll be focusing on midterms. And then we'll be in another presidential cycle soon come. But in all of this, I wanted to have you on because of not only where you rank with Democrats, but also to start having the conversation so we can begin to understand better the political process and how you, as I think a seemingly moderate Democrat, are different than an AOC Jamal Bowman type Democrat. And because a lot is made of, the comments that are made from AOC or comments that are made from you, where it tries to make it seem like the Democrats are falling apart or not on the same page or having friction. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I think that from the standpoint of the House Democratic Caucus, we're a big family. We're a diverse family. We're an enthusiastic family. What unites us is a desire to make life better for everyday Americans, for the people that we're privileged to represent. Now, in that context, in terms of our diversity, we're diverse in many different ways in terms of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, the regions that we represent, the life experiences that we bring to the House of Representatives, and in terms of ideology, from the most progressive members to the most centrist members and at all points in between. And by the way, I've got respect for every single member of the House Democratic Caucus, whether that is Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Connor Lamb, all points in between, because I believe that every single member is committed to fighting for the people, those individuals that they are charged with representing. In terms of labels, I think based on voting record, based on perspective, most would characterize me as a Black progressive.
Okay.
And a Black progressive, I think, is someone who views the issues that we confront in our society as anchored in the systemic racism that has been in the soil of America for 401 years. It's not to say we haven't come a long way. We have, but we still have a long way to go. But it's hard to look at the African-American experience as we've journeyed throughout this country and not understand that it has been shaped in large measure by the country's challenges with race. So that's how I view things. Now, you have others within the ideological spectrum outside of the House who may take a more class-based perspective in terms of the challenges that we confront in this country and view everything through the lens of class.
You're talking about like a Bernie type?
Well, I think Bernie traditionally, he would describe himself as a democratic socialist. And I think the analysis that is brought to bear in terms of the democratic socialist perspective is often more of a class-based perspective as opposed to a race-based analysis to the challenges that we all face. But at the end of the day, I think we all want the same thing, transformational change. And the question is, how do we bring it about?
How do we bring it about? And so what is your relationship like with somebody like an Andrea Ocasio-Cortez? What is that working relationship and or personal?
Well, in terms of a working relationship, again, I think as chair of the House Democratic Caucus, my chief objective is to support everyone's aspirations for making a difference in the communities that they represent as individuals. And so that often will take the form of making sure that people can get the committee assignments that are of importance to them, certainly within the New York delegation. I think that's the case with Jamal Bowman, for instance, and what he'd like to do in the Congress moving forward. I believe, advancing the issues around education and equity that have been important to him, or, Mondaire Jones, who is new to the Congress as well, very progressive, first African-American member of the LGBTQ community, first openly gay African-American member, along with Richie Torres, who coming into the Congress. He wants to, sort of advance issues of racial and social justice, perhaps serve on the Judiciary Committee. So I think with everyone within the New York delegation, in particular, the House Democratic Caucus more broadly, my job is to help advance the objectives that they bring to the House. But at the same time, in terms of policy, our objective is we have to get to 218 votes to get to anything over the finish line in terms of getting something done. So the bottom line is, how do we do that? How do we get to the strongest common denominator on all of these issues that are of critical importance, transforming our police department, ending the era of voter suppression once and for all, enacting, a livable wage for everyday Americans, crushing the virus, providing direct relief. And so you've got the individual piece of things where I'm committed to working with everyone. Max Rose, within our delegation was probably the more conservative member here in New York City. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, certainly the most progressive, but working with everyone to advance their individual objectives for their communities, but at the same time being cognizant of the fact that to get to anything done, we have to bring everyone together to get to 218 votes.
And so and I'm glad you said that last piece, because I think that's where some of the misunderstanding takes place, is because, you hear, well, Democrats lost seats in this last election because of, socialism. What do they call it? What was it? What did they say on stage? Kelly Loeffler down there last night was trying to call the pastor
liberal radical socialism.
Yeah, liberal radical socialism, or or even people blaming the hashtag defund the police for the reason, and so these are these more progressive ideals, and then you're saying, okay, look, you may have some of those, but your job is to go, what is the common denominator so that we can actually get some stuff done? And I think that sometimes the voting public doesn't know the difference.
Yeah, it's critical. So in 2018, Cedric Richmond, who's on his way to be a senior advisor to Joe Biden in the White House, Karen Bass, the current chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and myself decided that we would try to get something done in the area of criminal justice reform and work with the Trump administration, even though some of our friends suggested that that would be a fool's errand. But we took the position that because mass incarceration has been so devastating to our communities and has hurt individuals and families and neighborhoods because of the poisonous nature of the failed war on drugs and over-criminalization as a phenomenon, that we had a responsibility and an obligation to do something in this area to help currently incarcerated individuals, successfully rehabilitate themselves and reenter society so they could become productive citizens, and to strike a blow against the unjust sentencing laws that had been put into place in the 80s and early 90s, culminating with the 1994 crime bill. And so what we did was to enter into this effort to get as much done as we could. And that resulted in the First Step Act, which was the most meaningful piece of criminal justice reform.
Wait, no, Trump did that all by himself. That was all the Republicans. Democrats didn't have anything to do with what you're talking about.
Yeah, which is interesting because the bill, of course, was initiated in the House. I know that because I was the lead Democratic author on our side of the aisle and worked with Doug Collins, a conservative Republican from rural Georgia, who was the lead Republican sponsor. Now, the Trump administration did have a role to play in it. Ultimately, the president has to sign the bill into law. And Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, was involved in the negotiations. And we decided to work with him, Ebro, because we had a personal conversation. He came to the Hill, sat with Cedric and myself, and we wanted to get a sense of whether he was authentically committed to doing something meaningful on mass incarceration. And he told a story of his father having been incarcerated and the impact that that had on him growing up as a young adult. And we left that conversation, I believe, coming to the conclusion that Kushner was at least authentically committed to trying to do something meaningful. And we decided to enter into a negotiating partnership to see if we can do something that would help. And as a result of the First Step Act, thousands of people have been released, 90% of whom are Black men from federal prison. So it was a first step. But I say that in the context of your previous question, Ebro, which is, we know that you can't wave a single legislative magic wand and wipe away the impact of mass incarceration, which has been with us since Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971. That's 49 years. But you can take a first step, and then you can continue with sustained energy, sustained intensity, sustained commitment to do more until we finally eradicate it.
I like that Jared Kushner was so deeply affected by his father's incarceration that he decided to get a second father who's just a full-on public criminal. But that's neither here nor there. So what do you expect to see from the Biden administration in the first 60 to 90 days with regard to criminal justice and things of that nature?
Well, I think there will be a commitment to what I call reverse engineering some of the damage that was done by the 1994 crime bill and other efforts that come out of the law and order era. It may take longer than 60 or 70 or 100 days to do what's necessary in terms of being transformational. And I say that because what I think we need to do as a second step is to take a look at some of the consequences of the 1994 crime bill, which weren't just tough sentencing laws that were out of control at the federal level, but there was $9 billion in prison construction money that was included in the 1994 crime bill, made available to the states. But the states couldn't access that money unless they changed their sentencing laws to put into place things like 3 strikes you're out, or truth in sentencing, or mandatory minimums, or stripping away judicial discretion. And so when the 1994 crime bill was enacted, I believe there were less than 1 million people incarcerated in America. Today, there are 2.3 million. Less than 200,000 of those individuals are at the federal level. The majority of people incarcerated in this country are at the state level. But my view has been, you can't just simply say, we got to deal with the 94 crime bill and change the laws at the federal level, when the impact of the 94 crime bill was to set aside $9 billion, incentivize prison construction, knowing that those prisons will be filled, and then accelerating mass incarceration. The good news is, when I've talked to Joe Biden about this personally, he understands the importance of dealing with the collateral consequences that were unanticipated that have brought us to this moment. It may take more than 100 days because this is a phenomenon that's been with us now for over 25 years.
Hakeem, do you feel great about what you're seeing from Biden with regard to the cabinet, Biden and Harris with regard to the cabinet? What do you want to see moving forward? What hasn't been done, and you know, how do you feel overall with regard to whom they're putting in place?
Well, you know, I feel good about where we are, but of course we've got to wait until the entire song is completed. You may hear a couple of bars and say, well, that sounds good, or well, I'm not sure, that's hot. Or I guess the current phrase is lit. But
There you go.
My teenage sons are trying to keep me up on the lingo.
Daddy, nobody says hot, they say lit. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Lit, you know, so, but I think that, you know, we've got to wait until everything is complete. But when you look at the fact that he's already got 3 African-American women who have been appointed to cabinet level positions, that's more than at any other point in the history of the country. And he's still not even halfway done. We're still waiting to see what he does with respect to the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense. There are African-Americans who are in contention for the top spot. But at the end of the day, I'm less concerned about personnel and more concerned about whether the president and the vice president have a personal commitment to making the type of substantive and transformational change needed to bring about prosperity in every single zip code, to confront systemic racism, and to deal with the social and economic distress that are impacting the communities that I represent.
How far away are we from a new stimulus package and some money for the people? I know the House, you guys passed a bill back in July. Is it the Heroes? Is that what it was called? The Heroes Act or something like that?
That's right. Yeah, we passed the Heroes Act not once, but twice.
And so Congress, specifically Mitch McConnell, who's supposed to be bringing people together to make a decision, is just basically punted every chance he's gotten. So the Republicans literally have stood in the way of getting money on the ground to people who are not working, who are sick, et cetera, et cetera. Is anything going to happen before Joe Biden gets, sworn in, or will we wait until after January 20th?
Yeah, I think there's so much pain, so much suffering, and so much death right now being experienced throughout America in terms of the impact of COVID-19 that we cannot wait. And we have some deadlines that are getting ready to lapse in terms of unemployment insurance and in terms of other types of assistance that were first put into place by the CARES Act back in March. And we've taken the position as House Democrats that the COVID-19 pandemic is a once-in-a-century occurrence. It requires a once-in-a-century sustained congressional response. And Mitch McConnell hasn't seen it that way up to date. Now, over the last few days, he's come to the conclusion, as a result of some bipartisan negotiations that have been taking place between Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, that he's prepared to do something at or around $1 trillion. So we're negotiating those details right now. And while that is not comprehensive, it will be important to do in order to help get us through the next month or two. And then when Joe Biden is president, and perhaps if he has a Senate Democratic majority, we will be in a position to do much more to get us through this moment, to revive the economy, and to make sure that we are helping everyday Americans who are struggling.
You've called Trump individual one on your social media just recently, a day ago, with regarding to holding his cult rally in Georgia, which was a super spreader event. He's had many of them, and we continue to have just increases in deaths around the nation. My question to you is, do you support going after Donald Trump at the federal level as a criminal after he's not president?
Well, I support Joe Biden's perspective on this, which is that he's not going to get involved in any Department of Justice inquiries. He's just going to allow them to take shape based on following the facts, applying the law, and being guided by the Constitution, and then let the chips fall where they may. But I do believe that Joe Biden has also been handling things correctly in terms of this transition, which is Donald Trump's behavior speaks for itself. He only cares about himself. Joe Biden cares about the American people. And the more we continue to engage in looking backward as it relates to Donald Trump's aberrant behavior, his excessive behavior, his outrageous behavior, his corrupt behavior, the harder it is for us to try to find common ground in bringing the country together and tackling the serious problems that we have in terms of public health and in terms of the economy. And so
But
I
is
think
that
we've got
your position or is that Biden's position?
That's my position as well. We've got to allow the investigations to run their course based on the facts, the law, and the Constitution. But at the moment, keep our focus on getting things done for everyday Americans because there's so much pain, so much suffering, and so much death.
Hakeem, the House has gotten us a step closer to legalizing the ganja. How far away are we from having a national answer on marijuana legalization in this country?
The good news is I believe we're coming closer. And the House has taken, as you indicated, Peter, a historic step in descheduling marijuana at the federal level, which effectively means decriminalizing it, taking it out of the schedule, which aligns marijuana with heroin and LSD. That makes no sense.
No.
And it was all part of an effort to criminalize communities of color. If you go back to the Nixon era, his top advisors said the war on drugs was about holding back the African-American community. And they've been largely successful. So we have to reverse engineer that damage. And so we will decriminalize marijuana at the federal level, which allows for legalization in every state that chooses to do so across the country. But we've also said that you've got tens of thousands of people with low-level marijuana possession convictions who have been held back in their ability to pursue the American dream. Those convictions need to be expunged. And that was also part of our legislation. And then another final important component was to say, if we are going to create a new cannabis industry, which will provide opportunity for economic success, that opportunity can't be limited to just the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. We've got to create those opportunities for the least, the lost, and the left behind, particularly in communities of color that have been overrun by the failed war on drugs.
Yeah, just say it. Everybody came to black neighborhoods to get weed back in the day, Hakeem. You know the drill. If you wanted to get some weed, the white kids, everybody came to the hood to get weed, man. Them same places y'all been buying weed at since the 80s, they need to be done right.
It needs to be done correctly. That's our view. And, part of the challenge is that, and I said this on the floor of the House, that white Americans use marijuana in equal, if not greater numbers than black Americans. So why is it the case in a place like New York City, for instance, that 80% of the marijuana possession arrests are of black and Latino individuals? We can't have, marijuana use, socially acceptable behavior in some neighborhoods and criminal conduct in other neighborhoods when the dividing line is race. And since we can't proceed in a manner consistent with equal protection under the law or liberty and justice for all, we just have to decriminalize it. And that's our view. And by the way, to your earlier question, Ebro, I'd say that has brought together progressives within the Congress and moderates and a handful of Republicans who voted for the legislation as well, giving me hope that we can eventually get to a place in the United States Senate where they'll take this step.
Since you once famously quoted Juicy on the House floor, I hope that when this finally passes, Ebro, I think instead of Juicy, he should drop a few bars from Machine Gun Funk.
Was she going with Machine Gun Funk?
Yeah, you know what the big cough intro at the beginning. I think.
Hakeem, don't please.
Yeah, actually, don't do it. It would be a terrible idea.
I know. One day you may have Nancy Pelosi's job, so let's not do that.
Yeah, you know what? That wouldn't be a good look. Don't ever listen to me.
Let's not do that. Is that an aspiration of yours to be the Speaker of the House?
No, my aspiration right now, to tell you the truth, in the Trump era is just to get to the next day, and then the day after that, and then the next week, and then January 20th, Ebro. We just trying to get to
Start
January
talking about.
20th.
Yo, how good does it feel, Hakeem? Last thing I have for you. How good does it feel? And I just noticed this over the last few days. Ebro and I haven't even discussed it yet. That when Trump does anything right now, like puts out his statements, press conferences, there's no buzz anymore. Like he can't even get attention.
He's not the president.
Mm-hmm.
He just feels like he's been completely usurped of his power. Do you feel some sense of hope and gratification from that?
Yeah, no, without question. I mean, it's never easy to defeat an incumbent president. It's only happened rarely within the last century or so in American politics, the last 100 years. And Joe Biden was able to do it decisively in terms of the Electoral College, got more votes than any other presidential candidate in the history of the Republic, more than 80 million. And I think a lot of folks are beginning to move beyond Trump. That's not to say we won't still be dealing with Trumpism, but at least the poison that he represents as an individual, peddling, racial hatred and xenophobia and division and conspiracy theories, the fact that that has not gotten the same level of resonance, as you point out, Peter, as it had in the past, is a very important step for our country.
I want to leave with us talking about the black vote, Hakeem, and the Democrats placing more value on it, or I'd love to hear your perspective on the weight given to the black vote. In this current election cycle, no group voted more for Democrats than black people, upwards of, I think, over 90%. And then specifically when you get down into swing states, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Michigan, Detroit, Pennsylvania, Philly, Georgia, Atlanta. These are black towns with black voters. And often when we hear the Democrats talking, they always talking about bringing in, middle class whites and bringing in this and trying to build a better coalition with this one and that one. Do you feel like you have heard enough about the value? I know Biden said what he said, and I appreciate what he said, but I mean internally, in the working groups, in the smaller conversations, on those conference calls that I hear you leading often. Do you feel like people understand now how valuable this vote is?
I think there's a growing appreciation of it and a commensurate level of respect. Now we've got to make sure that appreciation and respect translate into results. But I would argue that we've begun to do that. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which we passed in June, was the most forward-looking, progressive, and transformational piece of police reform legislation ever to pass any House and Congress. Now we got to get it over the finish line in the Senate, but that was an important step in the right direction in dealing with what is a critically important issue for our community in terms of police violence, police brutality, and the police use of excessive force that has been with us for far too long. The John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act, which passed the House of Representatives, is another critically important piece of legislation because the other side of the aisle has adopted voter suppression as a tactic to artificially maintain power and limit our ability to make transformational change for our communities. We've moved that legislation. Now in the new Congress with a new president, I think what's going to be important is to elevate an economic empowerment agenda to promote entrepreneurship and access to capital, and to promote the ability for African Americans to participate in the jobs in the innovation economy of the 21st century. And I believe that Joe Biden is committed to doing that because he recognizes it's the right thing to do for America. And as he himself has indicated, he would not be on his way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue if it wasn't for black voters.
And then also I think Biden has a home ownership plan as well.
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned that, Ebro. Home ownership is critically important because when you think about the great American middle class and those who aspire to be part of it, and how most Americans transfer wealth from one generation to the next, from parents to children, children to grandchildren. Eventually, home ownership has been the way to do it. And within the African American community and the Latino community, home ownership rates are much lower than in white America. And so I think Joe Biden is onto something in doing the right thing in this area as part of an economic empowerment agenda. And we look forward to supporting that effort in the House.
Yo, Hakeem Jeffries, thank you for your time. I know the district you serve over in Brooklyn is which district again?
So it's the 8th Congressional District, downtown Brooklyn, Fort Greene, Clinton Hill. Biggie Smalls' old block. Why? I always shout them out. Bedford-Stuyvesant, East New York, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, west end of Coney Island and the Coney Island Peninsula, and then a little bit of Queens, including Howard Beach, which is, progress in New York City that I can represent Bed-Stuy and Howard Beach at the same time.
That's true.
And I want you to please send a message to anybody who will listen. This is just from Ebro. When activists and grassroots organizations come up with movements like defund the police and these things like that, that's what they're supposed to be doing. Can y'all as politicians translate that into actionable items and not let it become some sort of divisive mechanism so that we lose momentum?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because the other side is intentionally manipulating efforts at activism and some of the slogans and headlines that come out of these legitimate activist movements, such as Black Lives Matter, which is long overdue and a continuation of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. The other side tries to weaponize that politically. But activists have a very important lane. That's to push transformational change and to push those in power to hear the cries of the people.
That's right.
Craft legislation to respond and get things done. Now we have a responsibility to try to get to the highest common denominator in a divided Congress, where Democrats, for instance, only control the House and hopefully will control the Senate. Now we'll have a president. But the role of the activists, in my view, is to protest consistent with the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, the right to petition your government and demand change. But then to make sure that folks vote so that those who are serving in office share the values of the people who are protesting in the streets and pushing an activist agenda, so we're more likely to get the best possible results. So the two things work together, and I just urge young people to continue to do your thing. We hear you, we see you, we are you.
Hakeem Jeffries, thank you, man. Thank you for your time, and we're going to have you back on, later on February and March once Biden's in there and we get these Senate seats down in Georgia, because I know there's a lot of things y'all want to get across the line, and we want to see those done in short order, man.
Appreciate y'all.
Thanks,
Thank
Hakeem.
you very much.
Thank you, guys. Stay safe.
Care, bro. Peace.
All right, man.